It is a peculiar truth universally unacknowledged that a man in possession of a Sussex vicarage and a fondness for Victorian bell pulls will inevitably be found dead when the weather turns warm and the lilacs begin to bloom. Such was the fate of the late Reverend Percival Throssell, M.A., Cantab, discovered one sultry May morning slumped in his armchair, teacup unspilled, newspaper folded neatly, spectacles crooked upon his nose, and the heavy green velvet curtain of the east window trembling faintly though the air was still. The police, summoned post-haste by the vicar's housekeeper, Mrs. Bracknell, née Ducat, a widow twice and not disinclined to press her suit with clergymen, declared the scene most unnatural, which in their parlance meant somewhat too tidy. The doctor, whose practice ranged from ringworm to reluctant childbirth, muttered about cardiac arrest under strain, which is how country GPs account for the inexplicable. And all might have ended there, Reverend Throssell buried with due ecclesiastical pomp under a particularly complacent angel, were it not for Lord Peter Deathbred Whimsy, who arrived at Dunwith Vale quite unintentionally, quite incognito and quite irked by the butter at breakfast. "I say, Bunter," said Whimsy, flicking a crumb from his cuff and gazing at the post office wall where the village notice board leaned with characteristic inattention to angle or symmetry. "Why does the Church Times not advertise for clergy who can expire in a manner more decorous? A fellow who dies while reading the Times in a deck chair, say, but not mid-lesson, mid-sermon prep, or what was it again?" "Mid-evensong," said Bunter gravely. "Or rather, shortly before it, my lord. He was found at 4:23. The bell ringer reported the vicar absent, which in Dunwith Vale is cause for both ecclesiastical panic and several shillings lost at the local betting book." Whimsy flicked a glance at the church tower, which rose like a particularly embarrassed thumb from the copse of horse chestnut and hawthorn. 4:23, you say? Most inauspicious. That's the hour Keats supposedly wrote of being half in love with easeful death, though I doubt he envisioned it with digestive biscuits and a view of a duck pond. "It was fig rolls, actually, my lord," Bunter supplied with his usual tactful precision, and there was no breeze, yet the curtain moved. "Did it indeed?" Lord Peter raised a pale brow. "What a singularly well-mannered ghost. Remind me, Bunter, do we believe in such things before luncheon, or only after a second glass of Burgundy?" Bunter did not deign to answer. He had already produced the silver-tipped notebook in which he recorded the incidental details of crime, etiquette, and menu preferences in the same flowing copper plate. They approached the vicarage under an overgrowth of wisteria that looked as though it might seize inattentive visitors by the neck. The house was of the regrettable Victorian persuasion, Gothic-arched windows, overbearing chimneys, and an oriel that hinted at either romantic seclusion or appalling draughts. Mrs. Bracknell met them in black bombazine and moral outrage. "And I'm telling them, sir, as I'm telling you, it was no stroke nor seizure. A God-fearing man don't die with a look like that on his face unless there's been wickedness. I heard it. I heard a snap, like wood or bone, and I saw that curtain twitch, Lord forgive me, like it was alive." "Wood or bone?" said Whimsy with interest. "Not a sound one hears every Tuesday. And you say you saw the curtain move, but felt no draught." "It stood out like, my lord, as if someone had passed behind it. But there's naught there but the lead-light window and the old prayer stool." "Windows locked?" he asked. "Tight as a miser's purse." Whimsy's long fingers tapped at his lips. A misaligned window latch, a moving curtain, and a dead vicar who sipped tea to the end. "Bunter, you were quite right to pack my grey gloves. I think I shall require them. Let us pay our respects to the scene of the crime." And thus they entered the study, small, book-laden, with the scent of damp paper and old sermons. And there he was. The Reverend Throssell, collar slightly askew, eyes wide and glassy behind pince-nez, body collapsed as if the soul had slipped away while still considering Psalm 90. Whimsy bent low. Well, well, he murmured, almost fondly. Did the good vicar stumble upon something unholy? Or was it simply the shock of seeing fig rolls served without warning? He straightened and turned to the housekeeper. Mrs. Bracknell, tell me, who stood to benefit by the sudden demise of our dear clergyman? And be honest, I'm awfully hard to shock. She sniffed. Nobody, sir. He had no money to speak of, and no family save that niece from Kent, though she never came unless she wanted something, and she arrived 2 nights ago. Whimsy's eyes gleamed. Ah, a niece, conveniently visiting. Did she enjoy fig rolls as well? Number. She said they reminded her of dissected toads. Excellent, said Whimsy with approval. A girl after my own heart. And what precisely was the vicar reading when death laid its cold hand upon him? Mrs. Bracknell wrung her hands. The Apocrypha, my lord. Bell and the Dragon. Whimsy gave a quiet laugh, as if that explained everything. Very good. Then I think we shall begin, not with dragons or fig rolls, but with a proper look at that curtain. And so, beneath the stained glass eyes of long dead saints, and to the ticking of a lopsided clock that would soon matter very much indeed, Lord Peter Whimsy crouched beside a murdered vicar's armchair, contemplating the strange stillness of a curtain that had moved when there was no wind at all. Lord Peter Whimsy remained crouched beside the heavy velvet curtain, one gloved finger tracing the faint depression where the fabric hung slightly twisted, as if someone or something had grasped it with a nervous hand. He did not speak for several minutes. The room was hushed, save for the ticking of the ancient bracket clock on the mantel, which kept a rhythm both anxious and slightly askew. Bunter, who had long since learned the virtue of silence in such moments, stood by the door with the poise of a footman in a Gainsborough. Whimsy's gaze traveled from the curtain to the floorboards, then to the corner where the worn prayer stool sat, frayed and sun-bleached, with one leg shorter than the others. He tapped it with the tip of his cane. It wobbled obligingly. No dust here, Bunter, he murmured, eyes narrowing. None at all. Look, a faint scuff on the wood where the stool has been shifted. Very recently. You see how the dust settles along the edges of the rug, and yet here? He lifted the stool lightly. Smooth beneath. Which begs the question, who knelt to pray here yesterday, when our good Reverend died in his armchair, 3 feet away? Bunter stepped forward, his voice low. The stool is commonly used, my lord? According to Mrs. Bracknell, it's decorative. Something about an ancestor who built it from a pew fragment salvaged after Cromwell's sappers blew the roof off the original chapel. And I do believe I detect a trace of wax polish upon it, just a dab, likely recent. A surface lovingly tended, but not by Mrs. Bracknell, whose talents lie more in overcooked cabbage than beeswax. Whimsy straightened and turned toward the door. We must speak to the household, but not all at once. Let them ferment separately. The niece first, I think. She's young, she's clever, and she's already compared fig rolls to dissected toads. I like her instincts. The niece, Miss Camilla Throssell, proved to be as striking as she was sardonic. She had that faintly translucent look that comes with too much indoor reading and not enough cream in one's tea, and she met Whimsy with the dry-eyed defiance of a woman accustomed to watching old men expire inconveniently. I'm not in mourning, she said, gesturing to her maroon blouse and russet skirt with unapologetic flair. We hadn't spoken since Michaelmas. I visited out of duty and a vague suspicion he might have hidden something interesting in the library. No such luck. Mostly sermons and railway schedules. Miss Throssell, Whimsy said, settling into a chair opposite her. Forgive me if I do not commiserate. I find grief and curiosity to be poor roommates, though they frequently share lodgings. When did you last see your uncle? The night before he died. Supper. Bland. He said grace. We discussed St. Jerome and the Oxford comma. He seemed wound up, jumpy even. He kept glancing at the curtain. The same curtain that moved without wind. Camilla raised an eyebrow. Yes, I saw it twitch too, you know. But then, This house has creaks and drafts like other people have mice. Whimsy nodded slowly. Was he expecting a visitor? He didn't say so, but he asked me 3 times whether I had the key to the garden door. I hadn't touched it. In fact, I'm fairly sure he had it last. The old brass one with the cat head engraving. And where is that key now? I haven't the faintest, but it wasn't on him when they found the body, and it's not on the hook in the pantry, where it ought to be. Whimsy turned slightly, noting this with a faint tightening of his mouth. You arrived 2 nights ago, correct? Yes, Tuesday evening, the 6:10 train from Canterbury, though it was late as usual. Walked from the station. The air smelt of sheep and wet nettles. And your uncle answered the door. No, Mrs. Bracknell did. She was trimming her begonias and missed my knock. Said uncle had been in his study all day. I found him sitting there, just staring. He looked more like a gargoyle than a vicar. And you remained in the house the entire next day? I went for a walk in the morning, along the hedgerow path to Greatham Hill. Got back just before luncheon. Then I read, napped, and poked about the bookshelves. I didn't see him until Mrs. Bracknell shrieked like a banshee and came flapping about the landing. A vivid account, said Whimsy lightly. You've the soul of a novelist. I trained as a librarian, she replied. Same instinct, fewer royalties. Whimsy stood. Thank you, Miss Throssell. Should you happen to locate that garden key, or develop a craving for fig rolls, do let me know. Next, he found the bell ringer, a doughy lad with flaking eczema and a voice like wet gravel. Young Mr. Ormel was loitering by the lich gate with the expression of someone uncertain whether to dig a grave or fall into one. I rung the quarter hour, like I do every Thursday, he muttered, wiping his nose on his sleeve. Didn't hear nothing strange. Except maybe a thud around 4, but the floorboards creak and knock all over that place. Wouldn't pay it mind. You're quite certain it was 4? Ormel nodded. The little clock on the vestry shelf, I'd just lit the candle. The vicar usually comes to check the hymn list then, but he didn't. And you went to the study? Not straight off. Thought maybe he'd gone out. But when I passed the parlor again, I thought I saw something, like a shadow. So I went in. Found him there, eyes wide, like he'd seen something terrible. But there wasn't nothing in the room but that damn curtain, twitching like a bat was stuck in it. Whimsy glanced once more toward the tower. And the curtain, did it stop? Ormel looked pale. Stopped dead, like it knew I was looking. Back in the study, Whimsy examined the leaded window with great care. The latch was old and sticky but secure. The sill showed no scratches, and yet the angle of the light, the worn track where the curtain had been drawn repeatedly, and the faint, irregular depressions along the wainscoting below told a more interesting story. Bunter, he said quietly, we require the local locksmith. Quietly. I want to know whether the lock on the garden door has been disturbed. Also, get me a proper measure. I wish to test the distance from this window to the east path. And the curtain, my lord? Ah, yes. Measure it too. From rail to hem, I have a hypothesis about its length. If I am correct, someone hid behind it, but did not intend to do so for long. A light drizzle had begun outside. In the hallway, Camilla Throssell played a few tuneless notes on the vicarage's long-disused pianoforte. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard gave a groan like a sleeper turning in a restless dream. The house did not feel entirely empty. Whimsy turned once more to the armchair and lifted the teacup. Still warm, but not fresh. Someone brought him tea, he murmured, but not the housekeeper. He looked up. Bunter, summon Mrs. Bracknell again. I should like to know when precisely she brewed the vicar's last pot, and whether she tasted it herself. There was a pause. Also, he added with a faint smile, have her describe for me the teacups. I believe we may find the answer, a answer, in the crockery. He stared at the curtain one last time. And for heaven's sake, man, remind me to examine the garden path before nightfall. I have a curious sense it's been swept. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence in which, quite distinctly, something concealed begins to breathe. Mrs. Bracknell arrived promptly, her expression a carefully rehearsed combination of affront and genuine concern, as though the very suggestion that she might be involved in any impropriety was akin to the sacrilegious. She clutched a faded handkerchief embroidered with her initials in lavender thread, and breathed an exasperated sigh that suggested a household falling apart under the strain of a vicar's unexpected demise. "My lord," she began, "I can assure you the Reverend was not in the habit of receiving tea from anyone but myself. I am the only one competent to prepare his brews, and I have done so for these past 10 years without a single complaint from the parsonage. The last pot I made was at 4 o'clock sharp. I saw him take the cup with his own hand. He sipped twice before settling into his reading." Whimsy inclined his head, arching a brow. "And did you taste the tea yourself, Mrs. Bracknell?" She looked affronted. "I do not drink the Reverend's tea, my lord. It is not proper, but I can attest that I made it with fresh leaves from the new tin, boiled water from the kitchen kettle, and that I never leave the room until the Reverend is seated and content." "Admirable devotion," Whimsy said with a thin smile. "And the teacups, are they part of a matching set? Any peculiarity worth noting?" "There are 4 cups in the parlor cupboard, all the same pattern, blue with a gold rim. None have chips or cracks. I polished them this morning as usual." "Except one," Whimsy interjected gently. Mrs. Bracknell blinked. "Except one, my lord." "Yes. One of the cups at the scene had a tiny chip on its handle, barely noticeable unless closely inspected, and there was a faint smudge of something rather like grease or oil on the rim." The housekeeper's lips pressed together, but she said nothing. Whimsy stepped over to the mantelpiece where the clock ticked its uneven beat, then turned to Bunter. "The lock on the garden door. Is the locksmith here yet?" "Just arrived, my lord. I sent for Mr. Lowther from Greatham, an expert on all things mechanical and suspicious." Lowther entered quietly, a stout man with hands like pincers and spectacles perched precariously on the tip of his nose. He moved directly to the garden door and produced a small toolkit from his battered leather bag. "Lock's old but sound," he muttered as he worked. "No sign of tampering, but the mechanism is stiff. Someone's used it recently. See here, the keyhole bears the faintest scrape marks. Not from a master locksmith, though. Which means either someone's forced it clumsily, or the key itself is a poor fit." "Precisely what we need to know," said Whimsy. "Do you mind if I inspect?" Lowther handed over a magnifying glass with an air of reluctant respect. Whimsy crouched beside the door, turning the keyhole this way and that under the lens. "The scratches are very fine," he murmured. "Likely a trial and error attempt to open the door without the proper key. And see here, the catch is set firmly in the locked position. No sign of the door having been opened recently." He straightened. Yet Miss Throstle's assertion that the key is missing remains a mystery. If the door was not used, the key's disappearance is curious indeed. "Perhaps," Bunter suggested, "it was taken to mislead." Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. "A useful hypothesis. But let us not be hasty. Lowther, what of the distance from this window to the garden path?" "About 12 feet, my lord," said the locksmith, measuring with a tape. "Not impossible for a man to jump or climb if he were so inclined." "Unlikely for an elderly vicar, however," Whimsy murmured. He walked slowly to the window and peered out, noting the patch of earth recently disturbed and the faint footprints leading toward the hedge. The rain had begun to blur their edges, but the marks were clear enough to discern the passage of a hurried figure. "Bunter, fetch the gardener, Mr. Harper. I want to know when this path was last swept." While Bunter went, Whimsy returned to the study, where Camilla Throstle sat on the edge of a chair, watching him with quiet amusement. "You seem to find all this quite entertaining," she remarked. "On the contrary, Miss Throstle, It is a game most serious. The stakes are life and death, and the players." He paused, more delicate than one might expect. "Tell me, do you know if your uncle had any enemies in Dunwith Vale? Parishioners who might object to his sermons, or perhaps creditors pressing for repayment?" Camilla shook her head. "He was a private man, but not unpleasant. Some found his sermons a bit dour, perhaps, and he was said to have lent money to certain villagers, but nothing scandalous. The vicarage is hardly a seat of power. Yet sometimes the smallest pebble can start an avalanche." A sudden knock at the door heralded the gardener's entrance. Mr. Harper was a ruddy-faced man in well-worn boots and a hat festooned with twigs and stray leaves. "Good afternoon, sir. The path was swept yesterday afternoon just before tea. I did it myself. Miss Camilla was out walking then, I believe." "Thank you, Mr. Harper. And the garden gate? Any sign of forced entry there?" "No, sir. All's as it should be. The gate's old, but hangs well. I gave it a fresh coat of varnish last month." Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. "Then it seems someone might have sought entrance, or exit, without using the garden door." He moved toward the fireplace and retrieved a thin bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. "Miss Throssell, have you seen these before?" She shook her head as he unfolded them. They were in a neat, angular hand, the ink faded but legible. The letters spoke of borrowed money, vague threats, and cryptic references to the past that will not stay buried. "Your uncle had secrets," Whimsy said quietly. "Or at least something or someone he feared might return." Camilla's eyes darkened. "He never mentioned anything to me, but I always thought the vicarage carried its own shadows." "And shadows can move," Whimsy said. "Sometimes like your curtain, without wind." The afternoon waned, and the light dimmed beneath heavy clouds. Whimsy paced the study, piecing together the fragments. The missing key, the unswitched garden door, the disturbed earth outside, and a vicar who seemed more alarmed by his own curtains than by any known threat. "Tell me, Mrs. Bracknell," Whimsy asked when she returned with tea, "did the Reverend have a habit of opening this window? It looks rather out of place in a vicarage study." "Only on warm days, my lord. To catch the morning sun," he said, "and to listen to the birds. He was fond of the nightingale." "An open window might invite unwelcome guests," Whimsy mused, "or provide an escape for secrets." Mrs. Bracknell sniffed but said nothing. The teacups arrived, blue and gold as promised, but Whimsy's eyes lingered on the chipped cup. He ran a fingertip over the tiny fissure, noting the sharpness of the edge and the greasy smudge. "Oil," he said softly. "Or perhaps something more sinister." A finger wiped hastily after a deed done. Camilla watched him with a curious expression. "I suppose the curtain's movement was a signal." "Or a misdirection," Whimsy replied. "Someone wanted to create the impression of a ghost, or a poltergeist, a whisper of the supernatural to cover very mortal fears." He closed the letters and folded them carefully. "The past, Miss Throssell, has a way of catching up, and sometimes the past is a person." A sudden knock at the door startled them all. Bunter entered, looking grave. "My lord, Inspector Callaway is here. He wishes to speak with you." Whimsy smiled thinly. "Ah, the official dance begins. Very well, let us not keep the inspector waiting. After all, every curtain eventually rises." As the door closed behind them, the vicarage seemed to exhale. A breath held too long, now ready to reveal what lay hidden behind the green velvet. And somewhere, just beyond the garden hedge, footsteps vanished into the dusk. Inspector Callaway's entrance was as unobtrusive as a thud from a sledgehammer, his bulk filling the doorway before the words had quite finished their formation. He carried himself with the confident assurance of a man convinced the solution lay plainly before him, neatly wrapped and tied with a bow. Whimsy, reclining slightly against the heavy oak desk, watched him approach with the faintest curl of amused contempt. Lord Peter Whimsy, the inspector began without preamble. I'm grateful you could come at such short notice. The police have conducted the initial search, spoken with the household, and collated the evidence. But I gather your reputation precedes you, and perhaps you might glean what we have missed. Whimsy inclined his head with polite gravity. Inspector, the pleasure is mine, though I fear you might be overestimating my talents if you think I am any more than an amateur dabbling in shadows. Pray, what is your theory? Callaway's eyes narrowed as he produced a sheaf of notes. The late Reverend Throstle was a man of few enemies, but there are those in the village who might have had motive. His nephew, Reginald, recently returned from India, was overheard disputing with his uncle over the will. Then there is Miss Eleanor Pritchard, the housekeeper at the vicarage, who claims to have found the body. She's known to be somewhat temperamental. A fertile field of suspects, no doubt, Whimsy said dryly. And the cause of death? Blunt force trauma to the temple. We found the heavy brass bookend on the desk with traces of blood. An instrument of opportunity, Whimsy mused, rather than premeditated murder. Indeed, we also have witness statements placing the vicar in his study well into the late afternoon, and a note left on the desk mentioning a visitor expected at 4:30. Ah, a visitor, Whimsy repeated thoughtfully. Who was it? No one, apparently. The note was unsigned, and no one has come forward claiming to have been here. Whimsy tapped a finger against the blotter. Fascinating. An unsigned note to a dead man is a curious thing. Callaway frowned. It certainly complicates matters. Whimsy motioned to a chair. Do sit, Inspector. We have much to discuss. As Callaway settled, Whimsy allowed himself a moment to gaze once more around the room. The muted light filtering through the stained glass cast kaleidoscopic patterns upon the worn carpet. The curtain still hung askew, but no longer seemed to twitch. Tell me, Inspector, have you considered the timing of the bell tolls? Callaway blinked. The bells. The quarter hours. I confess I have not. Ah, then permit me to enlighten you. Whimsy drew a sheet of paper and a pencil from his pocket. The bell ringer, Mr. Ormel, insists he rang the quarter-hour chimes at the usual intervals, yet his testimony about a thud heard at 4 o'clock conflicts with Mrs. Bracknell's claim that she served tea at precisely that hour. Callaway raised an eyebrow. A discrepancy in the timeline? Precisely. If the Reverend was indeed sipping tea at 4, how could a thud have occurred simultaneously? Unless the tea was served after the thud. Exactly. Or the thud was something else entirely. I have reason to believe the thud was the fatal blow. Callaway's gaze sharpened. But who struck it? That is the question, Inspector. And to answer it, we must understand who had both motive and opportunity. Reginald, you say, argued with his uncle. Yes. Neighbors overheard raised voices. And Eleanor Pritchard? Where was she during this critical hour? Callaway consulted his notes. She claims to have been in the kitchen, preparing the evening meal. Alone? No, she says the cook and scullery maid were also present. Whimsy leaned forward, his fingers steepled. And yet, if the housekeeper found the body, she must have entered the study after the murder. Was she alone then? Did anyone see her? Callaway hesitated. No, but she insists she did not move the body. Curious, Whimsy said, because the chair was turned and the teacup you described was found on the floor, shattered. Callaway nodded slowly. We assumed it fell during the attack. Reasonable. But that raises another point. The cup bears a chip and a grease mark, as I observed. Whose fingerprints have you taken from the scene? Only the obvious suspects. Household staff and immediate family. Then it might be worth examining the gloves, Inspector. The Reverend was known to wear gloves indoors, especially when handling the curtains or his papers. Was he wearing them at the time? No, his gloves were found folded on the sideboard. Then the presence of grease on the cup suggests the killer was less careful. Perhaps nervous, perhaps inexperienced. But the question remains, how did the murderer gain entry if the garden door was locked and the window closed? Callaway looked thoughtful. We assume the killer used the front entrance, which the housekeeper would have surely noticed, unless the murderer was expected. Callaway nodded. The note mentions a visitor at 4:30, unsigned, but no one arrived. Whimsy rose and walked to the window, pressing a hand to the glass. Yet the curtain moved without wind. He turned sharply, eyes alight with a sudden clarity. "Inspector, I suspect someone hid behind that curtain. Briefly, long enough to observe and perhaps intimidate, but not long enough to be seen." Callaway frowned. "But why? And who?" "Because your victim had secrets, Inspector. And secrets have a habit of leaping from the shadows." He returned to his seat. "Now, about Reginald. Have you spoken with him?" Callaway pulled a folder from his breast pocket. "Yes. He claims to have been in town all afternoon, visiting the solicitor." "Alone?" "Yes. Any witnesses to that?" Callaway looked uncertain. "A clerk at the solicitor's office confirms his presence, but only briefly." Briefly is a curious word. It leaves room for deviation. "Are you suggesting he lied?" "I am merely suggesting the timeline is imperfect, and as we have learned, the timeline is the skeleton key to all locked doors." Callaway scribbled a note. "Very well. What about Miss Pritchard, the housekeeper?" "Ah, Eleanor," Whimsy said, curling his lips slightly. "Temperamental, you said?" "Yes, and fiercely protective of the household." "Which can be a useful mask for many things. Tell me, Inspector, has anyone checked her alibi rigorously? Is there any chance she left the kitchen unnoticed?" Callaway's gaze sharpened again. "Number, but it's worth investigating." Whimsy smiled faintly. "Indeed. And what of the missing garden key? Has that been found?" "Negative. The household reports it missing since the evening of the murder." "An inconvenient disappearance? It fits the theory that someone attempted to create a false impression of entry or exit." He paused, tapping his cane against the floor. "Inspector, this case is more than a simple burglary gone wrong or a jealous nephew's rage. It is a play with many acts, and the actors are hiding their parts." Callaway leaned back. "And what do you propose next?" Whimsy's eyes gleamed with that characteristic twinkle. A close examination of the servants' quarters, a re-interview with Miss Throssell about her walk and whereabouts, and, above all, the retrieval of any letters or documents your officers might have overlooked. And we must return to that curtain, the one that moved without wind. The inspector rose, nodding briskly. "I'll arrange it immediately." As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Whimsy and Callaway stood together by the window, watching the rain smear the garden into a tapestry of gray and green. Somewhere beyond the hedgerows, the faint scent of damp earth and the echo of footsteps, long vanished, stirred the air. Whimsy lit a cigarette with a practiced hand and exhaled slowly. "Callaway," he said, voice low, "the devil's in the details, and we have yet to uncover his favorite hiding place." The game was afoot. The servants' quarters at the vicarage were a curious microcosm of domestic order and barely suppressed friction. Whimsy, with Inspector Callaway in tow, navigated the narrow corridors and low-ceilinged rooms where the women who kept the household running lived and whispered. The air was heavy with the faint scent of starch and soap, mingled with something less tangible. The tension of lives lived in quiet servitude under watchful eyes. Miss Throssell, the Reverend's niece, had been staying in one of these modest chambers, and it was to her Whimsy directed his first inquiries. She sat primly on the edge of her narrow bed, a fragile figure of pale composure, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes were guarded but curious as she regarded the detective. "Miss Throssell," Whimsy began, his voice measured and polite. "You mentioned earlier a walk you took on the afternoon of your uncle's death. A solitary stroll, was it not?" She nodded. "Yes, Lord Peter. I found the house rather oppressive, and a bit of fresh air did me good. Indeed. And the timing? Just after 3 o'clock, I believe. I left shortly after tea was served in the drawing room. I was gone perhaps half an hour. Alone? Yes. I needed the space to think. Whimsy inclined his head. A most sensible course of action. And where did your walk take you? Through the village and along the lane by the churchyard. I wanted to clear my head before returning here. Inspector Callaway exchanged a glance with Whimsy but said nothing. Whimsy, however, took note of the precise phrasing. The lane by the churchyard, a place that afforded a view of the vicarage windows. Did you see anyone during your walk? Whimsy asked gently. Only Mr. Ormel, the bell ringer, preparing the tower for the evening tolls. He nodded but said nothing. And you returned directly here? Yes, around 4:15. I went straight to my room. Whimsy's gaze lingered on her face, noting the careful control, the slight tension about the mouth. And did you hear anything unusual upon your return? Voices? Sounds? She hesitated, then admitted, I thought I heard a sound coming from my uncle's study. A sharp noise, but I could not be sure. It was faint. A thud, perhaps? Whimsy's tone was light but insistent. She nodded. Yes, something like that. Whimsy turned to the inspector. This fits the timeline. Miss Throstle's walk concludes just before the fatal sound. She was out of earshot, but close enough to hear the noise upon her return. Callaway frowned. Which means the murderer was at work between 4 and 4:30, exactly when the visitor was expected. Precisely, Whimsy confirmed, and yet the visitor never came. Could the visitor have been a ruse? Callaway speculated. An excellent theory, Inspector, but what purpose would it serve? To draw the Reverend's attention elsewhere, perhaps, or to provide an alibi for someone inside the house. Whimsy smiled thinly. We shall see. Their next interview was with Miss Eleanor Pritchard, the housekeeper. She was a tall woman with a stern face, the kind that seemed carved from stone and yet bore an undercurrent of restrained emotion. She answered Whimsy's questions with clipped precision, revealing little but inadvertently betraying more. Miss Pritchard, Whimsy began, you told the inspector you were in the kitchen with the cook and scullery maid during the late afternoon. Yes, Lord Peter. We were preparing the evening meal. And no one left the kitchen during that time? She frowned. I did not leave the kitchen, no, but the cook stepped out briefly to fetch herbs from the garden. And the scullery maid? She remained in the kitchen. Curious, Whimsy mused, that the cook would venture outside at such a critical moment. Eleanor's eyes flickered. The garden door was locked. Yes, but the cook claims she found the key. The housekeeper's mouth tightened. I don't know where she found it. Neither do I, Whimsy replied smoothly. Tell me, Miss Pritchard, do you keep the keys to the vicarage? Only to the pantry and linen closet. Then who has access to the garden key? The Reverend usually kept it, but it has gone missing since the evening of the murder. Whimsy's interest piqued. Is it possible someone removed it to give the impression of forced entry? Eleanor gave a sharp nod. It's possible, but who would do such a thing? That is what we aim to discover. He turned to Callaway. May I examine the kitchen? Callaway gestured for the way. Whimsy scrutinized the layout, the position of the stove, the table, the door to the garden, and a small window that opened onto the yard. His eye caught the faintest smudge on the windowsill. Not dust, but a trace of dark grease. Did anyone notice this mark before? No, Eleanor said. It's quite ordinary for the kitchen windows to be opened for ventilation. Ordinary, yes, but notable when the window is normally kept shut during the afternoon. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. Whimsy pocketed his notebook and turned back. Thank you, Miss Pritchard. I believe we shall have more to discuss soon. The day wore on, and Whimsy's inquiries led him to the village post office, where he sought the solicitor's clerk who had seen Reginald Throssell. The clerk, Adi, was a young woman with nervous hands and bright eyes, who confirmed Reginald's arrival and brief stay, but could offer no more. "It was a busy day," she explained, "and I only saw him for a moment." Whimsy thanked her and departed, fingers steepled once more. The timeline was tightening. Reginald's presence in town was confirmed, yet the exact duration and purpose remained uncertain. Returning to the vicarage, Whimsy requested a closer look at the study. The room was dimming with the encroaching evening, shadows creeping across the floor like silent predators. He examined the desk, noting the disarray of papers, the overturned chair, and the broken teacup with its peculiar grease mark. He approached the window where the curtain had moved, recalling the strange fluttering with no breeze. Pressing his palm to the glass, he inspected the latch. It was locked, but the window could be pushed open with effort. "Inspector," he said, "it seems our visitor may have found an unorthodox entrance after all." Callaway nodded. "But that would require considerable agility and risk." "Indeed, which suggests desperation or familiarity with the house." Whimsy's gaze swept the room once more, catching sight of a small, nearly imperceptible scratch along the woodwork near the window frame. "Not all is as it seems, Inspector," he murmured. "The murderer played a dangerous game, leaving clues that point to intrusion while masking a far more intimate betrayal." The inspector frowned. "You mean someone from the household?" "Most likely," Whimsy replied. "Someone who wished to mislead and confound, to divert suspicion elsewhere." He drew his coat tighter as the evening chill crept in. The village was settling into darkness, the lamplighters' glow flickering along the lanes. The threads of the mystery were weaving themselves into a complex pattern, a tapestry of half-truths and silent fears. Whimsy knew the key lay in the minutiae, the overlooked detail, the whispered word, the glance that betrayed too much. And as always, the quiet house held its breath, waiting for the moment the curtain would finally be drawn back. He glanced once more toward the window. Outside, the rain began again, soft and relentless, as if washing away the surface to reveal the shadowed depths beneath. "Come, Inspector," Whimsy said softly. "We have work to do." The steady drizzle outside had settled into a persistent murmur by the time Whimsy and Inspector Callaway returned to the vicarage's parlor, where the household gathered under the weight of their shared unease. The flickering fire cast long, wavering shadows across the walls, lending an almost theatrical ambience to the scene. Yet, beneath the polite veneer, each occupant bore their own carefully concealed story, a narrative intersecting with the tragedy that had unfolded mere hours before. Whimsy took his place near the hearth, folding his hands and fixing the group with a gaze that suggested he was less a guest than a force of nature, patiently waiting for the delicate architecture of the truth to collapse of its own accord. His eyes lingered thoughtfully on Miss Throssell, who sat rigidly beside her aunt, the Reverend Sister, a woman whose calm exterior was not quite as unruffled as it seemed. "Miss Throssell," Whimsy began softly, "I have been considering your walk this afternoon, a solitary excursion with no witnesses save the bell ringer. Pray tell me, what thoughts occupied your mind as you strolled past the churchyard lane?" She looked down, twisting a delicate handkerchief. "I was troubled by my uncle's mood, Lord Peter. He seemed withdrawn. There was a tension about him I could not place, so I sought distraction in the quiet of the village." "Understandable," Whimsy nodded. "And did you notice anything unusual during your walk? Odd figures, strange noises, something out of place, perhaps?" Her eyes lifted momentarily, then fell again. "Only a curious thing, really. Near the old smithy, I saw a man standing by the wall, his hat pulled low, face obscured. He seemed to watch the vicarage, though I could not be certain. When he noticed me, he quickly turned and disappeared down the lane." A murmur rippled through the room. Inspector Callaway's brow furrowed, but he withheld comment, deferring to Whimsy's methodical lead. "Curious indeed," Whimsy said, voice measured. "Did you inform anyone of this stranger?" "No," she admitted. "I thought it best not to worry the household unnecessarily." Whimsy's gaze shifted to the Reverend Sister, Mrs. Harriet Wentworth, a woman of considerable presence and unwavering propriety. "Mrs. Wentworth, your niece's observation is intriguing. Have you or your brother received any visitors or correspondence from unknown parties recently?" Mrs. Wentworth shook her head, though the faintest flicker of unease crossed her composed features. "Nothing out of the ordinary, Lord Peter. We have had no unwelcome guests, and the mail arrives and departs as usual. But the presence of a stranger near the smithy is not to be dismissed lightly," Whimsy remarked. "This village, while quaint, is no stranger to secrets, nor to men who might wish to conceal their intent." The fire crackled, punctuating his words, while outside, the rain continued its unrelenting cadence. Whimsy turned to Callaway. "We must visit the smithy at once." The smithy was a squat, weathered building on the village's edge, its walls darkened by years of soot and smoke. The blacksmith himself, a broad-shouldered man with a face as rugged as the iron he forged, greeted them with wary eyes. "Good evening, Mr. Hambleton," Whimsy said, tipping his hat. "Might I ask if you noticed any strangers loitering about your premises this afternoon?" Hambleton scratched his chin. "Now you mention it. I did see someone strange. A chap dressed in a long coat and hat, kept to the shadows near the gate. Didn't come close, but I caught a glimpse. Looked like he was waiting for something. Or someone. Did he linger long?" "Long enough for me to finish my work and close up. Maybe an hour." "Did he speak to anyone? Make a sound?" "Not a word. Kept his head down, looked nervous." Whimsy's lips twitched. "And did you recognize him?" "No, never seen him before. Not from the village, that's for sure." As they left the smithy, Whimsy mused aloud. A man concealed by coat and hat, watching the vicarage with furtive interest. There is something decidedly theatrical in his appearance. Don't you agree, Inspector? Callaway shrugged. "The village gossip will have a field day." "Indeed. But gossip is the substrate from which facts must be carefully extracted. I suspect our mysterious visitor is a piece in a far larger puzzle." Returning to the vicarage, Whimsy requested a private moment with Miss Pritchard. In the dimly lit corridor, away from prying ears, he leaned closer. "Miss Pritchard, you mentioned earlier that the cook ventured into the garden with a key she supposedly found. Might I ask, what do you make of this?" Her eyes darted briefly, and a faint flush colored her cheeks. "It was most irregular, Lord Peter. The cook is reliable, but the timing was unfortunate. Unfortunate enough to provide a convenient window for a mischief maker." She hesitated, then whispered, "There has been talk among the staff. Whispers of a quarrel between the cook and the scullery maid. Small things, but simmering nonetheless." Whimsy raised a finger thoughtfully. "Interpersonal conflict in service quarters. A familiar engine for discord." He paused, then added, "Might I speak with the cook and the scullery maid separately?" Miss Pritchard nodded, relieved. "Certainly. They await your questions." The cook, Mrs. Featherstone, was a robust woman with a florid complexion and sharp eyes. Her denials were firm, but tinged with defensiveness. "I had no reason to be near the study at that time," she insisted. "Fetching herbs was but a pretext to clear my head. I saw no one." The scullery maid, young and timid, was less certain in her testimony. "I don't know about keys or strangers," she stammered. "I was in the kitchen all afternoon. I heard noises, but I thought nothing of them." Whimsy observed the girl's nervous glances, the way her fingers twisted the hem of her apron. "Might you tell me, child, if you have ever seen anyone else move about the garden at unusual hours?" The scullery maid shook her head vigorously. "No, sir. Only Miss Throssell and sometimes Mr. Ormel. Whimsy nodded, filing the responses away. There was something in the cook's hurried explanation that did not sit well with him, but for now, it was a mere flicker in the corner of his mind. As evening deepened, Whimsy requested to see the vicarage's clock, a large, stately timepiece mounted in the hallway, its pendulum swinging with a measured solemnity. He examined the hands closely, then moved to the wall behind it. "Inspector, observe how the clock's mechanism is slightly loose, causing it to lose time intermittently. Its chimes, too, are faint and can be mistaken for other sounds." Callaway frowned. "You think this could explain the timing of the noises heard?" "Partially. The clock's inaccuracies provide an opportunity to manipulate alibis." Returning to the study, Whimsy's attention was drawn to a small scrap of paper beneath the desk, a fragment of a letter, torn and crumpled. With gloved fingers, he unfolded it carefully. The words were hastily scribbled, a mixture of Latin and English, the latter betraying a nervous hand. "Must meet before the bells. No one knows but you. Trust no one. The truth lies beneath the surface." Whimsy's brow arched. A secret meeting? An accomplice or confidant hidden in the shadows? Inspector Callaway shook his head. If only the Reverend had confided in us, or feared for his safety enough to leave a clue. Whimsy mused. He replaced the note and turned to the window once more. The curtain hung motionless now, but the memory of its inexplicable flutter persisted. Whimsy's mind raced, piecing the fragments together. The secret note, the mysterious visitor, the servant's quarrel, the clock's unreliable chime. Each element was a thread in a tangled web, weaving a story not merely of murder, but of concealed motives and hidden identities. "We are closing in, Inspector," Whimsy said softly. But before the final act, the stage must be set just so. Outside, the wind picked up, sighing through the village lanes, carrying with it the faint scent of wet earth and something else. The faintest trace of iron. A warning or an invitation. The night was far from over. The dawn was reluctant to break through the persistent gray clouds that cloaked the village in a pallid twilight, as if nature herself hesitated to disturb the uneasy stillness settling over the vicarage. Inside, Lord Peter Whimsy paced slowly by the window, the weight of the cryptic note and its veiled warnings pressing upon him like an unseen spectre. The scrap of parchment, with its urgent injunctions and hints of clandestine meetings, seemed less a clue and more a provocation, daring him to unravel the tangled skein of secrets that lay beneath the genteel surface of St. Gregory's. His companion, Inspector Callaway, was already engaged in methodical questioning of the household staff, probing once more into the precise whereabouts and actions of each individual during the critical hours of the previous afternoon and evening. The routine disclosures, while informative in their minutiae, failed to yield a satisfactory explanation for the elusive visitor or the enigmatic fluttering of the curtain that had set the entire investigation in motion. Whimsy's attention, however, was drawn back to a small but telling detail he had previously noted with a subtle arch of his brow: the open window in the study. Though the room had been locked and ostensibly secure, the sash window was left slightly ajar, just enough to admit a slender draft that caused the curtain to tremble, its movement almost imperceptible, yet profoundly symbolic. It was the smallest of openings, but, as Whimsy knew, it could serve as a metaphor for the entire case. A subtle breach through which the truth might slip, unnoticed, but inexorable. Returning to the study, he carefully examined the window frame, noting faint smudges of soil on the sill and the delicate scratches on the paintwork. Signs that someone had indeed tampered with the window after locking up. More intriguing still was the absence of the usual cluster of cobwebs in that corner, as if disturbed recently by human hands. Whimsy's fingers traced the marks with gentle precision. "Inspector," he called, "this window tells a story of its own, one of surreptitious ingress or egress. But by whom and when? Callaway approached, eyes narrowing as he surveyed the evidence. The staff have denied anyone near the study after hours, save the Reverend himself. Ah, but the staff also have reason to conceal inconvenient truths, Whimsy murmured. And here we have an unmistakable sign of their equivocation. He glanced again at the open window, then toward the note he had secreted inside a drawer. The message, "Trust no one," now carried a weight that resonated deeper than mere caution. It suggested betrayal, close to home. The sound of footsteps drew their attention to the doorway where Miss Throssell stood, her expression troubled yet composed. "Lord Peter," she said quietly, "there is something else. I remembered last night that my uncle had received a visitor earlier in the day, someone he did not mention to any of us. A Mr. Alistair Crown, a solicitor from London, he claimed. They met briefly in the drawing room shortly after luncheon." Whimsy's interest piqued sharply. "A solicitor, you say? And no one else aware of this engagement?" "Only the housekeeper and myself," she replied. "Mr. Crown left soon after. I believe he promised to return tomorrow." Callaway rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "A solicitor in a quiet village and unannounced. That is an unusual occurrence indeed." "Unusual, yes, but potentially pivotal," Whimsy agreed. "Might I ask Miss Throssell to summon the housekeeper and prepare to show me the drawing room where this meeting took place?" Moments later, the trio moved through the subdued corridors to the drawing room, where afternoon light filtered softly through lace curtains. Whimsy's gaze swept the room, noting the placement of furniture, the position of the window, and the intricate Persian rug beneath their feet. "This room," Whimsy observed, "is rather far removed from the study, though the two are connected by the main hall. If Mr. Crown and the Reverend met here, it might explain why the study window was left unattended, allowing for the mysterious visitor's approach." Miss Throssell nodded. "The servants would not have thought to watch the drawing room closely." "Precisely." Whimsy's voice carried a dry amusement. "An ideal location for discreet conversations and, possibly, surreptitious exchanges." He moved to the mantelpiece, where a small silver salver caught his eye. It was tarnished and slightly askew. He lifted it, inspecting the underside and the surrounding surface. "A detail often overlooked," he murmured. "This salver is normally positioned centrally, but it has been shifted to one side. The mark of a hurried hand or an attempt to conceal something beneath." He beckoned the housekeeper forward. "Madam, might I trouble you for the key to the sideboard?" With a soft clink, the key was produced, and Whimsy lifted the lid to reveal a collection of letters and documents. Carefully, he sifted through the papers until he found an envelope addressed in a fine, unfamiliar hand. "Here, a letter unopened," Whimsy said, breaking the seal with a precise flick of his thumb. The letter was brief but portentous. "Dearest James, the arrangements proceed as planned. Our mutual friend's presence in the village complicates matters. We must act before the fortnight's end. Discretion is paramount." Whimsy's eyes flicked up, meeting Miss Throssell's wide gaze. "Who is this mutual friend, I wonder?" he said softly. "And what plans are afoot that require such secrecy and haste?" The housekeeper spoke then, her voice barely above a whisper. "There has been talk among the staff of a Mr. Penhaligon, a distant cousin of the Reverend, who has recently returned from abroad after many years. He is said to be visiting the village discreetly, though no one has seen him." Whimsy's mind raced. A concealed visitor, a secret solicitor, cryptic letters, and a family cousin whose arrival was shrouded in mystery. Each element was a piece of a complicated mosaic. The superficial tranquility of the village concealed a web of intrigues as tangled as any London court drama. "Inspector," Whimsy said, "I propose we extend our inquiries to this Mr. Penhaligon. It appears he may be the mutual friend referred to in the letter." Callaway nodded. "I will arrange to trace his lodgings immediately." Before they could depart, a sudden knock echoed through the hallway. Miss Throssell answered, revealing a messenger boy clutching a telegram. Whimsy took the envelope with a faint smile. Ah, the telegram. A modern missive of urgency. Breaking the seal, he read aloud. Return to London immediately. Urgent consultation required. Crown. He handed the note to Callaway. Our solicitor friend has been summoned away at a critical moment. How fortunate, or perhaps convenient. The inspector's expression darkened. This does not bode well for the clarity of our investigation. Whimsy folded the telegram with care and replaced it in his pocket. Indeed. But it does little to deter the patient mind. He glanced once more toward the study window, now bathed in the pale morning light. Time, he said softly, is a cunning accomplice to deception, and in this case, it is also our greatest adversary. The vicarage remained silent, yet beneath its quiet walls, the currents of concealed motives and half-truths churned relentlessly, preparing to unveil the next act of a drama far more intricate than anyone had yet imagined. The early afternoon found Lord Peter Whimsy ensconced in the modest yet tastefully appointed sitting room of the village inn, the hearth fire flickering its hesitant glow against the dull rain battering the mullioned windows. His coat was folded over a chair, and a half-smoked cigar rested languidly between his fingers, though he paid it scant attention. His mind was engaged in the labyrinthine puzzle that St. Gregory's had become, each revelation uncovering fresh perplexities. Inspector Callaway was poring over his notes with the earnest attention of a man determined to impose order on chaos. The solicitor, Mr. Crown, has indeed left London hastily, he reported, and all his colleagues seem equally unaware of his whereabouts. His absence seems most inopportune. Whimsy nodded, swirling the dregs of his brandy in the glass. Convenient, one might say, if the game were designed to mislead. But we must not despair of the truth. Recall that even the most intricate theater depends on the smallest of props. The most subtle cue can unravel the grandest of deceptions. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a breathless messenger, who bore a note hastily scribbled in an unfamiliar hand. Whimsy accepted it, glancing over the words with a sharpening gaze. "It seems Mr. Penhaligon is willing to receive us this very evening," Whimsy murmured. "An invitation, or perhaps a summons. It would be wise to accept forthwith." The journey to the cottage on the outskirts of the village was brisk but uneventful, save for the increasing sense of foreboding that accompanied each passing field and hedgerow. The cottage itself was a modest stone building, its walls cloaked in ivy and its windows shuttered against the dampness. Whimsy rang the bell once, then twice, before the door opened a crack, revealing a narrow-eyed man of middle years, whose face bore the weary marks of travel and secrecy. "Mr. Penhaligon?" Whimsy inquired with formal politeness. "The same," replied the man, stepping back to allow their entry. Inside, the cottage was surprisingly neat, though furnished with the barest necessities. A single oil lamp cast long shadows, and the air held the faint scent of tobacco and damp earth. Whimsy wasted no time. "You must forgive the intrusion, but matters of some urgency compel us to seek your counsel. We have reason to believe that your arrival and your presence in St. Gregory's are of some significance to recent events." Penhaligon's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "You speak plainly, Lord Peter, and rightly so. I have endeavored to keep my affairs discreet, but it seems discretion is a scarce commodity here." He gestured for them to sit, then produced a small leather-bound notebook worn with use. "I returned from overseas only last week," Penhaligon explained. "My cousin, the Reverend James Godfrey, has been in communication with me regarding certain family matters I had hoped to resolve quietly. It appears, however, that the situation is more complicated than either of us anticipated." Whimsy leaned forward. "Family matters can be particularly thorny. Might I inquire as to the nature of these complications?" Penhaligon hesitated, then said, "There are disputes over inheritance, yes, but more troubling are the insinuations of impropriety, whispered accusations that threaten to sully our family name. There is a woman, recently arrived in the village, who has cast herself into the Reverend's household, and not without causing unrest. The mention of this woman caused Whimsy to recall the soft-spoken Miss Throstle's vague references to a new companion at the vicarage, whose presence seemed to ripple uneasily beneath the surface of the household. "Do you suspect her involvement in the strange occurrences?" Whimsy asked, eyes narrowing. "I dare not accuse without evidence," Penhaligon replied gravely. "But I confess, my instincts warn me to be cautious." Whimsy smiled thinly. Instincts are often our first ally in the investigation, though they require the steady hand of logic to guide them. As they spoke, the conversation was punctuated by the sharp ticking of a clock mounted above the mantelpiece, a timekeeper whose rhythm seemed both relentless and mocking in the dim light. "I must ask, Mr. Penhaligon," Whimsy said, "about your movements on the day of the incident. Were you at the vicarage or elsewhere?" Penhaligon's gaze darkened. "I arrived late morning and remained until mid-afternoon, after which I took a brief walk along the lane to clear my thoughts." "And did you observe anything unusual during that walk?" Penhaligon shook his head. "Nothing out of the ordinary, save for a figure lurking near the churchyard gate. A man I did not recognize, who disappeared as I approached." Whimsy exchanged a glance with Callaway. "A stranger in the village at a critical hour." "Noted." They took their leave shortly after, the chill evening air closing about them like a shroud as they made their way back toward the village. Whimsy's thoughts turned inward, piecing together the mosaic of details, each fragment essential, yet incomplete. Back at the vicarage, they were met by a flurry of activity. The household staff seemed more nervous than before, their eyes darting like creatures disturbed. It was then that Whimsy noticed something that had eluded him in previous inspections: the housekeeper's discreet but persistent glances toward the east wing staircase. "Inspector," Whimsy murmured, "there is a matter that requires further examination." Together they ascended the staircase to the east wing, where a series of guest rooms and storage spaces lay. Whimsy's eyes were drawn to a narrow door, partially concealed by heavy damask curtains. "This door," Whimsy noted, "has a lock distinct from the others, and shows signs of frequent use despite its discreet placement." The housekeeper's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. Whimsy produced a small set of lock picks from his pocket, a habit born of countless investigations, and with deft fingers he manipulated the mechanism until the door creaked open, revealing a cramped study. Within the study lay a scattering of papers, some hastily gathered into a satchel. A small locked box sat on the desk, its surface scratched and worn. Whimsy's gaze sharpened. This room was clearly used for secret correspondence or meetings, but by whom? As he opened the box with a practiced flick, the faintest scent of lavender and tobacco wafted upward. Inside lay several letters, receipts, and a bundle of photographs. Some faded, others strikingly recent. One photograph in particular caught Whimsy's eye. A young woman seated beneath the ancient yew tree in the churchyard, her face serene but with an unmistakable hint of melancholy. The inscription on the back read simply, "Evelyn Godfrey, 1923. Whimsy turned the photograph over again, then shared it with Callaway. Could this be the woman Penhaligon hinted at? And if so, what role does she play in the tapestry we are unraveling? The inspector frowned. Her presence here is certainly suggestive. Perhaps a figure from the Reverend's past. Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. Or perhaps a spectre haunting the present. Suddenly, a faint noise, a whisper of movement, came from the corridor outside. They exchanged a quick glance and moved cautiously toward the door, only to find Miss Throstle standing hesitantly, her cheeks flushed and eyes wide. I thought you might want to see this," she said, extending a folded paper. Whimsy took it and unfolded the sheet. It was a page torn from a diary, penned in a hurried scrawl. "They watch me still. The visitor is not who he seems. Trust in no one. The curtain will fall soon. Whimsy's lips curled in a faint, grim smile. The metaphor of the curtain returns, Miss Throssell. Our mystery grows ever more theatrical. As the night deepened outside, the vicarage seemed to pulse with hidden life, shadows shifting behind drawn curtains and whispered secrets pressing close. Each new revelation, each half-glimpsed truth beckoned them onward, deeper into the maze of family secrets, concealed motives, and veiled dangers. Lord Peter Whimsy's eyes gleamed with the cold light of determination. The game was afoot, and he was ever ready to reveal the final act. The next morning dawned with a brittle clarity, the kind that sharpens senses and highlights every imperfection. The village of St. Gregory's was still shrouded in a tentative quiet, the rain having ceased overnight, but leaving the earth damp and the air thick with that peculiar earthen scent that lingers after a storm. Lord Peter Whimsy arrived at the vicarage well before the household had fully stirred, his footsteps muffled against the thick Persian carpet in the main hallway. Inspector Callaway followed at a discreet distance, their movements measured and unobtrusive, as though they were shadows weaving through a tableau of concealed motives. Whimsy's mind was already dissecting the diary fragment Miss Throssell had produced, the cryptic warning that the curtain will fall soon. It was, he thought, an exquisitely apt metaphor for the unraveling of pretense and the exposure of concealed truths. But to whom was the warning addressed? And by whom was it written? They made their way to the study in the East Wing, where the previous evening's discoveries had been made. The room was suffused with the pale morning light filtering through lace curtains, dust motes dancing lazily in the air. Whimsy's eyes traced the scattered papers on the desk, the locked box now open, its contents carefully examined and catalogued. "Have you inquired further of Miss Throssell about the diary page?" Whimsy asked. Callaway nodded. "She insists it was found tucked beneath the loose floorboard in her room. She says she had never noticed it before. A curious place for such a document, concealed rather than preserved," Whimsy remarked, his tone lightly ironic but thoughtful. One wonders whether the writer intended for it to be discovered or merely hid it in haste. The inspector scratched his chin. Miss Throssell seemed genuinely frightened. "She's willing to speak further if you desire." "Indeed." Whimsy's gaze flicked to the door, which opened then to admit the slender figure of the parlor maid. Her eyes were large and wary, the color of storm clouds. "Miss Throssell," Whimsy began gently, "may I ask about the last time you saw the Reverend before the tragedy?" Her lips trembled faintly. "It was the evening before, sir. He seemed troubled more than usual. He spent much time alone in his study, writing letters." "Letters concerning his cousin, perhaps?" She nodded. "Yes, and something else, but he would not say." Whimsy leaned forward slightly, voice lowering in confidence. "Did he mention any visitor or visitor's intentions?" Her hesitation was brief but telling. "There was a man, a stranger, I think, who called at the vicarage a few days earlier. The Reverend was upset after speaking with him. Can you describe this man?" She swallowed hard. "Tall, with dark hair and a scar along his jaw." He spoke quietly but with great insistence. "Did the Reverend say why this man had come?" "No, sir, only that it was urgent." Whimsy exchanged a glance with Callaway. "Thank you, Miss Throssell. You have been most helpful." Once alone, Whimsy pondered this new figure, a stranger with a scarred jaw, demanding and urgent. Clearly, he was a piece of the puzzle yet unaccounted for, a variable that disturbed the neat lines of their timeline and character assessments. Returning to the study, Whimsy picked up one of the letters found in the locked box. The paper was fine, the handwriting hurried but elegant, penned in an ink that had begun to fade. "My dear cousin, the affairs of the estate and the shadow that falls across it require your immediate attention. There are truths that cannot remain buried, and those who seek to unearth them are not to be trusted. Be wary of those closest, for appearances deceive. I fear that the danger is not only financial, but personal. The letter was unsigned. A warning, but from whom? Whimsy mused aloud. Callaway suggested, could it be from this visitor who disturbed the Reverend? Possibly, Whimsy agreed, or from someone within the family, attempting to manipulate from the shadows. Their thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock, and the butler, Mr. Trenchard, entered, his expression composed, but with a flicker of something, perhaps unease, behind his steely gaze. Lord Peter, Inspector, if I might intrude, he said, bowing slightly. There has been a development in the village that might interest you. Whimsy raised an eyebrow. Do proceed. Trenchard produced a folded sheet from his pocket, a telegram bearing the London postmark. It arrived this morning for Mr. Crown, Trenchard explained, from a Miss Evelyn Godfrey, requesting urgent correspondence. The mention of Evelyn Godfrey caused a quiet ripple of recognition. Whimsy unfolded the telegram. Urgent. I fear my presence here endangers more than my reputation. Please come to St. Gregory's at once. I have knowledge that will clarify all. Whimsy folded the telegram carefully. Evelyn Godfrey, then, the mysterious woman in the photograph. Callaway frowned. A woman suddenly seeking to intervene in a family feud. Intriguing. It seems our curtain is indeed on the rise, Whimsy said, voice tinged with ironic amusement. They agreed to await Mr. Crown's return, hoping his arrival would illuminate the shadows gathering in St. Gregory's. Meanwhile, Whimsy requested a detailed schedule of the household's comings and goings over the last fortnight. Precise times, however trivial, could reveal the cracks through which truth might seep. The day progressed with measured investigation, questions to servants, examination of household routines, and the careful noting of inconsistencies. Whimsy's ear was especially attuned to the smallest discrepancies, the subtle misalignment of clock hands, the unusual manner in which the vicar's study was locked and unlocked, the cadence of footsteps in the hallways. At dusk, an unexpected visitor arrived at the vicarage, a woman of striking presence whose dark eyes held both determination and a certain weariness. Evelyn Godfrey. Her introduction was formal but edged with urgency. She carried herself like one burdened by secrets, yet unafraid to confront them. Lord Peter Whimsy, she said, I've come to set right what has been twisted. My presence here is no mere coincidence. Whimsy inclined his head with that arch mixture of courtesy and skepticism that had become his signature. Miss Godfrey, we are all ears. Pray, begin where you will. She took a steadying breath. The truth is more tangled than you suspect. The vicar was not merely caught in a dispute over property or inheritance. There are things buried long ago that someone is desperate to keep hidden. My arrival has stirred those who would rather see the past remain silent. Her gaze flicked briefly to the curtains at the window, as though she sensed unseen eyes. I believe the man who visited recently, the one with the scarred jaw, is involved in these matters. He is not what he seems. Whimsy smiled thinly, his thoughts racing. Every new confession, every fresh disclosure tightened the web around them. Miss Godfrey, he said softly, we have been gathering pieces of a puzzle, but the picture remains incomplete. Your testimony will be invaluable. As night descended, the vicarage once again embraced its cloak of shadows, but beneath the surface, the tension was palpable, like a string drawn taut, poised to snap. The curtain was indeed rising on the final act, and Lord Peter Whimsy, with his customary blend of wit and incisive intellect, prepared to reveal the secret truths that lay hidden behind polite facades and whispered lies. The vicarage's drawing room, where Evelyn Godfrey had been received with polite reserve, now hummed with an undercurrent of urgency. The shadows cast by the flickering fireplace played tricks on the walls, lending an atmosphere both intimate and fraught, as if the room itself awaited the unraveling of secrets long buried beneath its worn tapestries. Lord Peter Whimsy sat poised, his expression one of keen attention beneath the veneer of casual ease. Miss Godfrey, seated opposite, had unfolded the tale of a family torn not merely by inheritance, but by something far more corrosive: betrayal, guilt, and a past that gnawed at the present with relentless teeth. "I must confess," Evelyn began, her voice low but unwavering, "that I have been something of an interloper in these affairs, though not without cause. My connection to the Crown family is complicated. A liaison once thought inconsequential, but one that has carried consequences neither of us foresaw." Whimsy leaned forward slightly, fingers steepled. "Indeed, Miss Godfrey, the tangled webs of the heart are often the most perilous. Pray, elucidate." She sighed, a small, almost imperceptible movement, then continued. "Years ago, I was involved with Matthew Crown, the vicar's elder brother, now deceased. Our relationship was clandestine, and its ending was marked by bitterness and regret. After Matthew's death, I remained a peripheral figure, largely ignored by the family and the village. Until recently. Until the man with the scarred jaw appeared." Whimsy interjected, his voice a shade lighter, but still carrying that unmistakable edge of irony. "Yes," she nodded. "His name is Victor Langford, a solicitor from London, though his methods suggest something far more intrusive. He has been probing into the Crown estate and the family's history with a persistence that unsettles even me." Callaway frowned. "A solicitor, you say? Usually such men prefer discreet inquiries, not confrontations." "Victor Langford is not a typical solicitor," Evelyn replied. "His purpose is personal. He believes there was foul play surrounding Matthew's death, something covered up by the family. He seeks to unearth proof, to challenge the inheritance and expose those he suspects." Whimsy's eyes narrowed slightly. "And whom does he suspect?" "Primarily the Reverend Charles Crown, though the accusations are whispered rather than spoken aloud. Langford's presence here is no accident. He has come to St. Gregory's to gather evidence and perhaps to unsettle the household." A knock interrupted the conversation, and Mr. Trenchard entered, bearing a small, weathered package. "For Lord Peter," he announced quietly, handing over the parcel with a discreet glance toward Evelyn. Whimsy carefully unwrapped the package. Inside lay a sheaf of letters, yellowed with age, tied with a faded blue ribbon. His fingers traced the delicate paper as he examined the script, Matthew Crown's handwriting, unmistakably. "These must have belonged to Matthew," Whimsy said. "Miss Godfrey, were you aware of these?" Evelyn's gaze was troubled. "Only fragments. After Matthew's death, I was given a few letters, but none that explained the full story." Whimsy began to read aloud. The first letter dated several months before Matthew's passing. "Dearest Evelyn, the shadows lengthen not only over our estate, but also upon my soul. There are forces within the family whose allegiance is as shifting as the wind, and I fear that my discovery will bring peril not just to me, but to those I care for. If anything should befall me, know that the truth is buried in the ledger kept by the housekeeper. Guard it well." "Interesting," Whimsy remarked. "A ledger kept by the housekeeper. Miss Godfrey, have you ever seen this document?" "No, I have not," she answered, "and I was unaware of its existence until now." Callaway looked toward Mr. Trenchard. "Might you know of such a ledger?" The butler's face tightened imperceptibly. "There is an old account book maintained by Mrs. Pritchard, the housekeeper. It records household expenses and transactions. Whether it contains anything more, I cannot say." Whimsy's mind pieced together the implications. "We must examine this ledger. It may hold the key to understanding the financial undercurrents that have so troubled the Crown family." Evelyn's next words were hesitant. "There is more, Lord Peter. The night before Matthew died, he confided in me about a meeting with Victor Langford. They were to discuss matters of great importance, but Matthew was anxious, almost fearful." Whimsy smiled thinly. "Fear. the eternal accomplice to mystery. As evening deepened, the conversation took on a more speculative tone, the guests parsing the scant facts for meaning. Evelyn described Langford's visit to the village pub, where his inquiries had unsettled locals long protective of family secrets. The vicar's reclusive nature, too, took on new weight, suggesting he might have been defending something beyond mere property. Whimsy, ever attentive to detail, noted the subtle shifts in Evelyn's narrative. Pauses, glances toward the window, the slight tightening of her lips when speaking of Langford. Was there something she withheld, a secret even from herself? The conversation turned toward the diary page found beneath the floorboards. Whimsy held it up, the words, "The curtain will fall soon," etched in faded ink. "Do you believe," Whimsy asked quietly, "that this was a warning from Matthew to Charles?" Evelyn shook her head. "I think it was from Charles to himself, an admonition against the darkness encroaching. He was tormented, torn between loyalty and suspicion. Yet he remained silent," Whimsy mused, "until the night he died." Callaway interjected. "The timeline suggests he was at the vicarage late into the evening, yet the murder occurred after he was seen leaving for a walk." "That inconsistency," Whimsy said, "is pivotal. The contradiction between appearances and reality is where the truth hides." Later, when the house was still and quiet, Whimsy requested the housekeeper's ledger. Mrs. Pritchard, a stout woman with steely eyes, reluctantly produced the book from a locked drawer. The ledger was a jumble of numbers and names, but Whimsy's practiced eye quickly detected irregularities. Large sums withdrawn without explanation, payments made to obscure recipients, and entries erased or overwritten. "Financial tampering," Whimsy said. "Evidence of desperation or concealment." Among the entries, one name recurred, Victor Langford. "Here we have proof of his involvement beyond mere legal counsel," Whimsy observed. "These payments are sizable and frequent." Callaway frowned. Could Langford be both investigator and beneficiary? "It would explain much," Whimsy replied. "He profits from stirring unrest, but to what end?" The night deepened, and as the household retired, Whimsy sat by the fire, thoughts churning. The game was nearing its conclusion, but the final move remained elusive. He glanced once more at the diary page, the words haunting in their brevity. The curtain was indeed poised to fall. But on whom? And with what consequences? Outside, the wind sighed through the eaves, stirring the curtains just so, as if the house itself whispered its secrets in anticipation. Tomorrow, Whimsy would make his play. The stage was set, the actors assembled, and the truth awaited in the silent spaces between words and deeds. The gathering was summoned to the drawing room at precisely 9:30, the flickering gaslight casting elongated shadows that seemed to lean in as if eager to overhear the denouement. Lord Peter Whimsy, impeccably dressed and radiating that peculiar blend of languid charm and razor-sharp scrutiny, stood before his assembled audience. The vicar, the housekeeper, Evelyn Godfrey, Callaway, and, notably, the solicitor, Victor Langford, whose scarred jaw now appeared less a mark of menace than of desperation. Whimsy began without preamble, his voice calm, but carrying the unmistakable edge of finality. "I trust you have all pondered the curious phrase scrawled in the diary, 'The curtain will fall soon.' It was not merely a poetic flourish, but a coded message, a warning written by Charles Crown himself, foretelling the climax of a carefully staged tragedy." He paced slowly, eyes sweeping the room. "We know that Matthew Crown was deeply entangled in the estate's murky finances. The ledger, maintained with a deliberate hand by Mrs. Pritchard, reveals a pattern of payments designed to misdirect suspicion and to conceal a debt far greater than the family could admit." Whimsy turned to Langford, whose composure was visibly cracking. "Mr. Langford, your frequent visits to the village and your conspicuous payments from the ledger were not the acts of a mere solicitor. You sought to destabilize the family's hold on the estate, knowing that by inciting suspicion and fear, you might wrest control for yourself or a client unknown. Langford's eyes darted around, his jaw tightening. You have no proof. Oh, but I do. Whimsy interrupted with a sardonic smile. Consider the timeline of the night in question. You claim to have been walking the cliffs at the time of Reverend Crown's death. Yet a witness, Mrs. Pritchard, heard your voice inside the vicarage, long after you purportedly left. Your alibi is as thin as the curtains in the study, which, I might add, were deliberately left ajar to allow a certain draught. Enough to move the fabric, but not enough to let in any external noise. He gestured to Evelyn. Miss Godfrey's recounting of the final, fearful meeting between Matthew and yourself was more than hearsay. It was a desperate attempt to warn of the impending betrayal. The curtain falling was a metaphor for your calculated removal of both Crown brothers from the scene. The room's silence was broken only by the faint crackle of the fire. Callaway, standing beside Whimsy, produced a small folded paper from his coat pocket. This was found concealed within the ledger, an unsigned confession drafted in haste, admitting to the manipulation of records and a plan to clear the field. Langford's facade crumbled. You misunderstand. It was never meant to come to this. The estate was sinking. I had to act. And act you did, Whimsy said softly. But it was not only financial ruin you sought to hide. The psychological torment of a man cornered led to his own undoing. Reverend Crown was no murderer. He was the final victim of your machinations. Turning to the vicarage household, Whimsy concluded, justice is seldom neat, but it demands clarity. The true nature of guilt lies not in motive alone, but in the choice to silence truth with violence or deceit. Langford's shoulders sagged, and with a final bitter glance, he surrendered. The household exhaled collectively, relief mingled with lingering unease. As the guests began to disperse, Whimsy lit a slender cigar, the smoke curling in lazy rings. One might say, he mused, that the house itself has secrets too stubborn to remain hidden, and that sometimes the subtlest movement of a curtain reveals the grandest deception. With a nod to Evelyn and a farewell to Callaway, Lord Peter Whimsy stepped into the night, leaving behind a vicarage forever altered, where shadows had been drawn back, not by force, but by the patient light of reason.